Do I have sound? Yes, perfect. Hi, everyone. Hi, everyone. Hi. Come on, Vegas, man. Anyway, I'm very happy to welcome you all. It's nice to see such a big room. Last year, I had many less people because I was competing with a Playboy application by Vertigo. So it was kind of hard. But anyway, today, apparently, it's less interesting than the rest. So I guess everybody's pretty excited about what we saw this morning. Personally, I'm very excited because, finally we have the possibility to develop on so many screens. WPF for very rich client applications running on Windows. Silverlight out of the browser for desktop applications, a little bit lighter, running on the Mac as well. Silverlight in the browser, and now Silverlight on the phone. That's great. And the good thing is that everything we will see today applies to all those screens indifferently. I'm going to show you samples in WPF, samples in Silverlight. The tools and frameworks that we are going to see work in both environments, or I should say 3 environments, because we have the phone now. Okay, so overnight we became mobile developers. I think that's pretty cool. But the good thing is that you don't need to learn new things. Okay. So with that, my name is Laurent Bugnon. I work for IdentityMine. I am what they call a senior user experience integrator, meaning that most of my job happens in Expression Blend. And I'm going to show you quite a lot of things running in Blend today. IdentityMine is based in Seattle. We are specialists in user experience, especially in the domain of WPF, Silverlight, Windows mobile phone applications, Surface, etc. And myself, I'm located in Zurich in Switzerland. So let's start by understanding what does MVVM mean. Okay, so that's kind of a weird acronym. It stands for Model, View, ViewModel. And if you want to be very popular, you can use some very catchy phrases like, I'm going to do MVVM in a sloob with slut, which means I'm going to do MVVM in a Silverlight out-of-the-browser application with the Silverlight unit test framework. More seriously, though, WPF and Silverlight are really built on top of MVVM. So even if you never used intentionally MVVM, you actually already used it. A simple example of that is the controls. All the controls in WPF and Silverlight are actually a mini MVVM application if you want, because they have code, they have dependency properties, expose, binding, and they have a template, and they have a strict separation between the template and the code. There is also quite a lot of confusion around MVVM, and I hope that this session helps to clarify that a bit. When we talk about MVVM, this is really just a pattern. Okay? It's also known as presentation model. I'm sorry, could you just start the timer? That would be great. Just that I know approximately, because I have a lot of things to show you, so I don't want to bother Rob Eisenberg, who comes after me. So yeah, MVVM is really just a the pattern. So also on presentation model. Okay, we are going to talk about that in a moment. And in addition to that, you have really a lot of MVVM frameworks out there. MVVM toolkit, I do one myself, so I'm guilty of that too. Those are really just helpers around the pattern. Okay. So we are going to try to differentiate clearly what is the pattern itself, what is MVVM, and what are helpers helping you to build Silverlight and WPF applications. So to understand where does presentation model or MVVM pattern come from, let's talk a little bit about those separation patterns. Probably the best known is MVC, Model View Controller. That's the interactions. And this is a very old pattern, very well known. It has been used since probably the 80s with Smalltalk back then. Okay, it is still used widely, especially ASP.NET MVC, Rails, etc. Now, a variation of the MVC pattern is called the passive view pattern. And this one was developed by Martin Fowler. And here is the interaction. So the advantage that we see here is that the view is completely passive. And since the view is passive, since it's not actually reacting to anything, okay, you don't need to test it, at least not in unit tests, which is good because testing a view is very difficult, automatically at least. you most often need a human operator to test the view to make sure that everything reacts correctly. So with a passive view pattern, you don't need to test the view. The controller has a lot of responsibility, and since the controller is code, you can test it. Now there is another variation of the passive view pattern, which is called presentation model pattern. And here the controller is replaced by what we call a presentation model, also known as a view model. The interactions look like this. And here we see the difference. The view is a little bit more active. The view is actually pushing information to the view model. And just before I said it's good when the view is passive. So what is the trick here? Well, the trick is really when you have a framework with data binding, for example, like WPF and Silverlight, then you don't really need to worry about this, about the view being active, because that's built in the framework. So you don't need to test data binding. Microsoft did that for you. Okay? So you can really expose as much code as possible in your view model. You can unit test that. The view is quite passive, not as passive as in the passive view, but on the other hand, you have this whole very powerful data binding network or system to support you. So that's really cool. I want to talk a bit about blendability. So there are a couple of sessions, actually 3 sessions about MVVM at MIX. And when I saw that, I wrote an email to the guys and I said, well, what are you going to talk about so that we avoid overlaps? So I'm going to concentrate a bit on blendability here. The other areas where MVVM helps you a lot are testability, because you can test your view model. So a big part of your client application is testable. And of course, maintainability, because you can, since your components are pretty separated, you can replace one by another one without having to modify the others. Okay? Now, blendability is the ability to be edited in Expression Blend, okay, and Visual Studio Designer, because since both use the same architecture, what works in Blend actually works mostly in the Designer of Visual Studio as well. So to achieve blendability, there are 2 things which are important. First of all, you should be able to differentiate in your code runtime from design time. Why? Because Blend is actually loading code and executing code. Okay? It's not just a passive development environment. So sometimes it will find places where it cannot execute the code, and it's going to crash. Blend is actually not crashing itself, but what happens is that you have a beautiful exception screen, and you cannot design against that. So the first part is identify those places where Blend cannot display the screen, and isolate that. And then the other thing which helps for blendability is to provide design time data, so that your designers who work in Blend or integrators have something to design against. That's very useful. For example, if you work against a service which doesn't exist yet, okay, that happens more often than we think. The service is developed at the same time as the client application. So then you can provide already dummy data. Okay? Also, sometimes you just cannot connect through Blend to a service, for example, a WCF service. It just doesn't work. So you can provide design time data. So with that, let's see a demo. Here we go. OK, so here I have a Silverlight application. But again, I want to stress that everything I show you works actually in WPF as well. So this Silverlight application has a reference to a WCF service, which is returning a list of customers. And then I have a high-level service. I'm going to make that a little bit bigger. I have a high-level service which is on top of my WCF service. Okay, I like to do that because it allows me to really abstract my data source completely. So that's pretty convenient. Now this service has one method called getCustomers. And this method is going to connect to a WCF service. So since in Silverlight everything is asynchronous, I need to provide a callback. And this callback will be executed when the data comes back from the WCF service. Now this callback is expressed as an action, so that's a pointer to a method if you want. And the first parameter is a list of customer. and the second one is an exception. Now, the exception might be set if something went wrong during the service call. Okay? Otherwise, the exception is just null. Now, this customer class is actually the customer class which is created for me by Visual Studio when I connect to the WCF service. Okay? I can use it directly in my application because WCF has a very neat feature. When you create a WCF proxy by connecting to the WCF service, it's actually implementing an interface called iNotifyPropertyChanged, which we will see a little bit more later, which means that you can create data bindings to properties of that object. Okay? So one possibility if you work against WCF is just use the proxy and do your bindings against the proxy. So now what I'm going to do with that is create a non-MVVM application so that we see a little bit the difference. So the first thing I will do is add a dependency property into my code behind. So this property is a dependency property, meaning I can data bind against it. Okay? Notice that it is located in the page, in the code behind. This is an observable collection, so that's a list of customer. Now I need to populate this collection, and I'm going to do that by using my high-level data service that we saw just before. So here I create the data service, and then I'm calling the getCustomers method, and I said I need to provide a callback. So here you will see a lot of that in my code. I love lambda expressions. That's a lambda expression, which is basically an anonymous method. This anonymous method has the two parameters that we discussed before, customers, which is an enumerable of customer. It's a little bit small, but that's what IntelliSense is telling me, and the error. I may show the error in case there is one, or I'm just going to create a new observable collection with my enumerable of customers. That's a new feature of Silverlight 4, by the way, that you can create a new observable collection with an enumerable. That's pretty cool. All right. So now I have my code ready. Now I need to do a little bit XAML. First thing I will do is add a data template. Now one data template here represents one customer. So I type this by hand. I have a first name and a last name property in my WCF object, but I need to know that. Okay? I don't have any helper. Basically, I need to read the documentation of the guy who did the service to see what properties do I have. So it's not super convenient. Later, we will see how to do that in Blend and see how much better the experience is. Also, the styling, well, it's pretty simple, pretty basic, but still, I have to do everything by hand. Next thing I will add is a list box to show my list of customers. And here we see that I have the item source, which is a list, okay, through an element name binding to the customer's dependency property that I created before in the main page. And I'm using my customer template. So now, if the demo gods are with me, it should work. I'm very courageous. I'm actually connecting to the internet, so we'll see if that works. And here we go. Okay, so this list of data is written from the WCF service, which is running on my web server. So how does it look like in Expression Blend? So if I go in Blend, I will see my blue list box, but I don't see any data. Now, that's totally normal because Expression Blend is not executing any code behind. Okay, that's one limitation of Blend. So all this code, which is creating my dependency property and connecting to the service, is not run at all. So if I want this to work in Blend, let's transform this application into an MVVM application. The first thing I will do is remove this dependency property and also remove the call to the service. Then I'm going to create a new layer. So I add a folder. Here we go. And I'm going to add a new class. And I'm going to name this class main ViewModel. So I have a one-to-one how should I say, coupling, if you want, between the page, which is called main page, and the view model, which is called view model. I could have settings page, settings view model, etc. That's kind of a convention, but it's a good one. So here I have my view model. I'm going to implement that here. And here I see that my main view model is implementing the iNotify property change interface that I mentioned before. So this interface has one member, the property change event. And this member needs to be raised, to be fired, if a property changes inside the view model. So it's kind of a lightweight version of the dependency property that I had before, okay? And the reason why I prefer to use that in my view model is that it's very much lighter. You can serialize it. It has quite a lot of advantages over the dependency property. Dependency property is fantastic for controls, for UI, okay? But when you work in the view model, prefer something lighter. The raise property change method, which is here, that's just a utility method. So now I can add my customer's property again. Oops, inside the class would be better. All right. So now I see that I have again my customer's property, which is again an observable collection of my WCF proxy, my customer object. And I need to remember when I create a new observable collection to raise the property change event. And then I can bind against that. Now let's add a constructor to this view model. Okay, I do something which is not very usual. I'm going, as soon as my view model is created, connect to the data service and get my list of customers. So now I need to connect things together. I have my view model, I have my view. I need to bring both together. So let's do that in XAML. First thing I will do is declare here a new prefix. And I'm going to map this prefix to my view model namespace, which interestingly is not here. Okay, let me just build that. Oops. Okay, and see what namespace am I in here? Inside view model, yeah. Okay, now it's here. So I rehearsed that 15 times the view model appeared. And now it's not. So basically what it does, it's a little bit small, but IntelliSense shows you the list of namespaces that you have, and then you can just press enter, and then you have a mapping, so you can import all those objects into your XAML. Then the next thing I will do is create here an instance of my view model. Okay. So now what I do here is actually not the best practice ever, because for two reasons. First reason, when I use that, when I create my instance of view model directly in the resources, when the XAML parser reaches this line, it's going to create the view model. So I don't have a precise control over the creation, over the lifetime of my view model. Okay? That's probably one of the easiest way to do this binding, but it's probably not the best. The other reason is that XAML doesn't allow you to have a constructor with parameters when you do that. It is using the parameterless, the default constructor. So you cannot, for example, inject stuff into your view model. Okay? So it's not the best way, but for this simple demo, it will do. And then later, we will see a better way to do that. So now that I have an instance of my view model inside my XAML, I can just do binding equals static resource main view model. So I am binding the data context of this grid to my view model, which allows me now to remove this element name binding, because everything I do inside the grid is now, if I don't precise it explicitly, is now in reference to the view model. So I can remove my element name binding. Instead, I'm going to bind to the customer's property in the view model. Let's run this code. Same as before. So now I have an MVVM application, so it should work in Blend, right? Well, unfortunately, it's not that easy. If I go to Blend and reload everything, we see that we have an exception. Now, my code is executed. I know that because this message box is actually shown by my code. So what happens here? Well, let me show you a trick to find out. What you can do is actually go into your ViewModel. Let's go in the constructor, and I'm going to put a breakpoint here. And then I'm going to attach the Visual Studio Debugger to Blend. Make sure that you select the correct solution. That's Silverlight code, which is running in Blend, but that's fine. It just works. It works in WPF as well. Now, if I go into Blend, just need to refresh. So I'm just going to open the page again. And now I jump into my ViewModel. So now I can debug, which is pretty cool. Thank you. I didn't invent that, but I think it's cool. It works. I will pass the clap, the applause to the Blend team. So now I can see that I can create my data service. That's fine. But when I execute the next step, it's crashing. Okay? So now I know exactly which code is not blendable. So I'm going to isolate this code. To do that, I'm going to check in my code if I am inside the Blend design tool or inside Cider. This property is true in Blend and in Cider. If I am inside Blend, I'm going to create 15 new customers. Notice that I'm using actually the WCF proxy. I'm creating dummy data, but that's directly the proxy with first name, last name. And then when I'm not into Blend, I'm going to connect to the real service. Now I can build. And now, no hands. No hands. Crap. Just going to build into Blend, and here we go. Okay? Sometimes you don't need to build. So now I have my 15 customers, which is great because I can visually go ahead and change this data template. Edit current. I'm just going to do something super simple. Select the two text block and take, for example, this one. Let's do this one a little bit bigger. Well, just playing. Okay, so here I have my design time data. If I run, I can run directly from Blend. Then it connects, and I get my real-time data. Okay? So my application is now blendable. Now, creating design time data in Blend, there are multiple ways to do that. One way is to use here the Data tab, where you can, for example, create a new sample data source. So here it requires quite a lot of manual work. So you have to really type the properties, or you can import from XML. That's one possibility to do this. Another possibility, you can also, and that's new in Expression Blend 4 in the beta, you can actually create sample data. Let me see if I can zoom on that. Create sample data from a class. So you can directly connect to your ViewModel and create sample data. That's pretty cool. I don't have examples of that here, but if you check the Blend team, they are showing this demo off, so that's a pretty good thing. The way that I show is reusing really exactly the proxies that are coming, so you know what you get. All right. So what I showed you now, model, view, ViewModel, and bindings, that's MVVM. Everything else is helpers around MVVM. Okay? So it's not that complicated, really. Okay? It's just a pattern. So those helpers that I mentioned to bridge the gap between the view and the ViewModel, well, sometimes it would be good if the view could notify the ViewModel that something happened. For example, a control has been clicked. And that's a good job for commands. We'll talk about that in a moment. In the other direction, it's good also sometimes if your ViewModel can notify the view that something happened. There are multiple ways to do that. You could even do events. One way that I like is using messages. We will see an example of that. Messages are pretty good also because very often you don't have just one view and one ViewModel, but instead you have multiple ones. And communicating from one ViewModel to another can be quite tricky, but if you use a messaging system, it helps you a lot. Okay? So let's talk a little bit about commands. Commands, I was looking for a good definition, and well, that's what I came up with. Commands is something like a point of entry for a method. It allows you to expose a method as a property in your view model. So you can data bind against that. All right? It is an implementation of the iCommand interface, which has 3 members. The execute method, which is called when the command is invoked. The canExecute method is called from time to time by the UI, and it should return true or false. True if the command is enabled, and false if the command is disabled, depending on the context of the command. And canExecute changed, that's an event that you should raise when the value of canExecute changes. So basically, if you see, OK, my context is changing, OK, the properties around me are changing, and now there is a risk that my command is disabled. You should raise the event to make sure. We'll see an example of that. So commands in WPF and Silverlight have one problem, one disadvantage, that they can actually only be used by certain controls, namely all the button-based controls, so button, toggle button, checkbox, radio button, etc., and the menu item. And only for the click event. So only when you click on those buttons will the command be executed. But thankfully, you have ways around that. We will talk about that later. Now let's say a few words about messaging. Okay, there are multiple messaging systems available. Prism has one called the Event Aggregator. I'm also doing one in my MVVM Lite toolkit, and that's the one we will see. Surprise, surprise. So messaging should be simple by default. By default, it should really be simple to send a message and to receive a message. But if you want more, you should be able to open filtered channels. For example, not broadcast to everybody, but instead send only to a target type. For example, the main view model sends a message targeted to the settings view model. Like this, you avoid a lot of code because you don't have to check, is this message really for me? Okay? Also, you should be able to send a message, really a direct message with a token, where you say, OK, I know this object, so that's kind of a contract, if you want, between the objects. The first one says, I'm registering with the token 1234. And the other one knows, OK, if I send with 1234, it will reach that particular guy. If I send with 2345, he will not receive it. So again, you can minimize the code needed to receive a message. There should be no constraints for a messaging system, in my opinion. If you need to implement an interface to receive a message, in my opinion, you're doing it wrong. Okay? So let's see demos. Oops. So the first thing I want to show you is commands, where I'm going to use the normal WPF and Silverlight way to do commands. So here in my XAML code, I have, here I have one button which is using a property called sayHelloCommand, which is placed on the main view model. And then I'm also going to use a command parameter, which is set through an element name binding to the text property of a text box. So that's a string. Notice that I don't have a click event here. The command is going to be invoked when the button is clicked. Now, if I open my ViewModel folder, here I have this sayHelloCommand, which is declared as a property of type sayHello. We will see that class. And then I'm creating this command here. Now, I also have a separate class for my command. So here we start having a few troubles, because I have an additional class that I need to maintain. And this class here requires actually a reference to the main view model, because I'm going to observe through the property change event. And if a property which is named counter changes, I'm going to raise a canExecute change event. So I'm going to say, when the counter property changes, you should evaluate my canExecute method, because there is a chance that I'm going to be disabled or enabled. Now, this canExecute method is observing the view model, and check the counter property. And if I can divide this property by 2, I'm going to return true. So I enable my command when counter is even, and I disable it when it's odd. And then I have the execute method, which is invoked when you click on the button, which is just going to show a message box. So now if I run this, I have say hello, so I can here enter my name. Okay, that works. And if I increment the counter, I see that my button is disabled. That's automatically through the command. When I enable this, counter changes, my can execute change event is raised, the UI is asking my can execute command, hey, what's your status? Okay, and I will return false. And now I can re-enable it. All right? So that's a super simple implementation, but I still need a separate class to do that, which is too much code. Okay? I mean, you know, what breaks in your application is code, so you want to minimize that. Okay? So instead, I'm going to use a component called relay command. And here, too, there are multiple implementations of that. The one from the MVVM Lite toolkit, which I will show in a moment, is called relay command. In Prism, there is delegate command. They have small differences, but the principle is the same. Relay command was actually developed by Josh Smith, who is a WPF guru and also a colleague of mine at Identity Mind. He wrote this book called Advanced MVVM. This dives quite a lot deeper. So if you're interested, you can check it out. It's pretty good. So now, the XAML didn't change at all. I have exactly the same XAML code. I'm going to go to my say hello command on my ViewModel. What changed, however, is that I don't have this say hello class anymore. Instead, I am using here a relay command, which is, in that case, I have two versions, a generic and a non-generic version. The generic version is for when you have a comment parameter. So it's going to cast the parameter directly to the right type for you. You don't have to worry about that. In this case, a string. That's the content of the text box. And then creating the relay command happens here. I have two delegates, which I expressed as lambda expressions. The first one is the execute method. So the parameter is of type string, and I'm going to show my message box, same as before. The second one is the can execute method. So again, I get a parameter. In this case, I'm not using it. I can check my private attribute, counter, and if it can be divided by 2, I'm going to return true. This syntax is a little bit confusing because there is no return keyword, but that's how lambda expressions do it. I'm actually returning true, okay, or false, depending. Now notice I don't have my annoying reference to my main view model anymore because I'm inside the main view model. I can access my private attributes directly. It is here. And also, inside the counter property, every time that it changes, I'm going to call the raise can execute change method on the relay command. So I'm going to say, hey, the counter property change, you should re-evaluate me. Now if I run this, we will see that same result as before. Can go ahead, MIX10, say hello, and I can also disable it the same way as before. So the gain is that I have a lot less code than before. I don't have an additional class to maintain. Now let's talk about the messenger. So here for the messenger, I'm going to run the app first. That's now a WPF app. I have two windows. And notice that into this window, the text box shows empty. Now, if I send a message from the first window to the second window, it now shows hello. Okay? I can also send a message with a callback. That's very convenient in some scenarios where you want to send a message and then there is an asynchronous operation going on and then you want to get a callback. In this case, I'm sending the message with a callback. Notice that the callback button is enabled and I can send a callback back to the sender. So how does it work? Well, first of all, let's take a look to in the recipient class. So this is a totally standard window in that case. Okay, the messenger doesn't actually have anything to do with MVVM. I can use that in any type of application. But in MVVM, it helps you in certain scenarios. Okay? So again, no confusion. Messenger, relay commands, that's actually helpers. So now, when I receive, so I need to register on the default messenger, register for a message of type string. And here I don't add tokens or whatever additional constraints. So I just say every time that a message of type string is broadcasted to everybody, please pass it to me. And then this delegate is going to be executed. I get the message of type string, and I can go ahead and set the text property of the text box. For the callback, it's just a little bit more complicated because I'm going to use a message type which is built in the MVVM Lite toolkit, which is called notification message action. So that's basically just a message with callback. So here, the message is now of type notification message action. I can set the text property to m.notification, which is a string, and then I will save the message for later. And then I enable the callback button, which, when it's clicked, it's going to go ahead and execute the callback. So I'm going to send a message back to the recipient, to the sender, sorry. Now, to send the message, let's go in the main window now. If I send a string, that's one line of code. I'm going to call messenger.default.send, and then you can send anything you want. Okay, simple values, integer, booleans, strings, or complex objects, for example, the selected item in a list, for example. For the callback message, it's just a little bit more complicated. I'm creating, this time, a new notification message action. The notification is set to hello, call me back, and I give a delegate for the callback. And the callback, I could also express that as a Lambda expression if I wanted. In this case, I'm created a separate method with a message of type string, and this string is actually the type which is declared here. Okay? So here again, the callback can be anything. So that's the implementation. Now let me show you a fun little application which I did. So that's an MVVM app. Each window has a ViewModel, and the ViewModel communicate together so that every time the position changes, the position of the other window changes too. And I can actually even resize the windows. Okay. Also, a cool thing is that I can undock them for a while. So now they are undocked. But if I want, I can go ahead and dock them again. And now they are docked again. If I close one, the other one will close too. Every interaction between those two windows and their view models happen with a messenger. Okay? I will publish all those samples. Okay. Oops. So those components, relay command, messenger, the ones that I show here, again, there are multiple implementations of that, but the ones I showed are part of the MVVM Lite toolkit, which is an open source framework that I maintain. The goal of the toolkit is break the monotony. Okay? In MVVM, you have to write quite a lot of code. Commands, you have to write your iNotify property change implementation. And honestly, writing code, who likes that? So you try to avoid that as much as you can. So by using the toolkit, you can write a little bit less code. This is the Get Started page where you have all the documentation. This is hosted on Codeplex. And V3 is actually released at MIX. I didn't release it yet because I had to wait for Expression Blend Beta and Silverlight 4 RC because everything is compatible with what you just saw. The goal is to keep it small and simple as much as possible. And everything works in WPF and in Silverlight with the same code, almost. Okay? There are just a couple of tiny differences. And since it works in Silverlight, it works in the phone as well. And actually, with version 3, I prepared an MVVM Lite template, or project template for Visual Studio for the phone. So you can do new Windows Phone application directly pre-wired with your ViewModel. And that works. You have two DLLs, two assemblies. First one, which I call the essentials, with relay command messenger that we saw. And ViewModel base, it's a utility class with a raise property change method, and also a couple of additional properties, helper properties. And then what I call the extras, which is another DLL, with event to command. Event to command is a behavior, we will see a sample in a moment, which allows you to bind any event on any framework element to any command. Okay, so you don't have the restriction, the annoying WPF and Silverlight restriction that you have to bind to the click event of a button base. Okay? And also dispatcher helper, that's a very small class which helps you when you do multi-threaded applications. And then you have tools, project templates for Visual Studio 2008, 2010, Expression Blend 3, and Expression Blend 4. Item templates as well, so you can really go ahead and say, file, new project, new MVVM Lite application, and run it. Code snippets also to, again, write less code, so you can type, for example, MVVM INPC for iNotify property change, and then expand it, and you get all the property which is already written for you. So let's see demos. All right, so now for this demo, okay. So this demo is set up a little bit the same as before, in the sense that I also have a reference to the same WCF service. And I also have my data service, which is this high-level service that I'm going to use to communicate with my WCF service. So this data service still has the getCustomer class. In addition, it has another method called saveCustomer. So now I can also save a customer back to the WCF service. And also a difference is that it implements an interface called iDataService. Now this interface is defined here with the two methods, getCustomers and saveCustomer. So the advantage of declaring my service as an implementation of an interface, okay, is that I can have multiple implementations of that interface. For example, I can have a design data service, which is pretty cool because I don't like to mix my design data and my runtime data. Okay? So now this design data service is going to create a list of customers and 100 of them and return them. And I also have a dummy implementation for saveCustomer. Now let's take a look at the main view model. The main view model still has the observable collection of customers that didn't change. It also has an additional property called isBusy. This property will be set to true whenever an asynchronous operation is running. Okay? So that the designer can notify the user that something is happening. But for the view model, it's just a Boolean, so you can actually test that. Then it has two commands. The first one is called saveCustomer. The other one is called refresh. Refresh is going to reload the list of customers, and save is going to save an instance of the customer. Also, what changed is that now I'm injecting my data service. I'm not creating it inside the main view model constructor anymore. So for the main view model, it doesn't matter what implementation of the iDataService interface it gets. Okay? That could be a mock data service that you are mocking for unit tests. Or that could be a design time data service. Or the real stuff. Okay? Now, another thing that maybe you noticed already is that I now have an additional class which is called Customer View Model. So why do I need that? Well, before I was working with a customer WCF proxy, but that's a generated class. If I want to add properties to that class, I cannot because it is generated for me by Visual Studio. So by wrapping it inside the Customer View Model, I can add properties. For example, one property which is called isDirty. And I'm going to set this property to true whenever the customer has changed but has not been saved to the WCF service yet. To set this property, I'm going to observe the property changed event of the WCF proxy, because remember that WCF proxies implement iNotify property changed, okay, which is a cool feature. And every time any property changes, I'm going to set isDirty to true. And then my service is going to be responsible to set isDirty to false when it saves the customer to the WCF service. Again, this can be tested. Finally, I now have a class called ViewModel Locator. So now this class answers a problem, which is that, as I said before, when you have your ViewModel directly in XAML, it works great with Blend. But the big problem is that you don't have any control over the lifetime of your ViewModel. And also, you cannot inject anything because XAML uses only the default constructor. So instead, I'm going to use this locator class. And let's do some setup. Now, here in this sample, I'm using the Unity container of the Unity framework. That's an IOC container made by Microsoft Patents and Practice Group. Now, it's not a must. You could actually go ahead and create your view models directly in code with new main view model and create your services and bind them together. A lot of applications nowadays use an IOC container of a certain kind, so why not reuse it for your view models? But again, it's not a must, okay? So here what I'm going to do is, notice that this is static, okay? I'm going to create, if I am in design mode, inside Blend and Cider, I'm going to say for my iData service interface, you're going to register the design data service. And if I am running in runtime, for the same interface, I'm going to register the data service class. And then I'm also registering my main view model with a container control lifetime manager, which is basically a fancy way of saying that's a singleton. Okay? Now, why do I do that as a singleton? Well, you know, it's just more convenient in that particular case where I have only one instance of my view, one instance of the view, one instance of the main view model. Now, if I had an implementation, for example, you know, WPF pop-ups, where I have multiple instances of a view, of course, I need to register differently so that I have also multiple instances of my main view model. Okay? So it depends what you do, but that's just code. Then I'm going to expose a property. Oops. Here we go. And notice that this property is not static. Now, the reason why it's not static is that I cannot bind against static properties in Silverlight. So for code compatibility with WPF, I'm actually using non-static properties to expose my view models. And here, I'm simply going to resolve the view model. Now, some people prefer to bind their data context in the code behind. I don't have anything against that. I'm not going to ostracize you for that. But you know, if you do that, you can, for example, do the setup here and then go ahead and resolve your view model and bind it directly in the code behind. That works too. It works less good with Blend, though. All right, so at this point, I should be able to build my application. And now let's change to Expression Blend. So I prepared a very simple UI with a cache. And this cache is going to be shown when an asynchronous operation is running. For the moment, I just push it aside. And now I'm going to bind my view model to my view. Now, if you use a new MVVM Lite application in Visual Studio, for example, file, new project, new MVVM Lite application. And by the way, you can do that directly here. So here we see the templates for WPF 4, WPF 3.5, for Windows Phone 7, yoo-hoo, Silverlight 4, and Silverlight 3. And you can also do that in Expression Blend, by the way, because the templates are also installed for Blend. So if you do that, file, new project, and new MVVM Lite application, you don't need to do this wiring. That's done for you. But I think it's pretty cool to show in Blend how to do that. And also it helps if you have an existing non-MVVM application that you want to convert in an MVVM app. So the first thing I will do is go inside the project. So I'm going to create a global resource, create object data source. I'm going to call that locator. And I select the ViewModel locator class that I implemented just before. Let's say OK. And now we see that here I have my property main of type main ViewModel, which I can drag and drop on the user control. This is automatically binding the data context. And here we go, I'm ready to roll. Okay? Now, I could have done that in XAML, but I need to remember the syntax. It's a little bit easier in Blend. So now I can go take the button, and by the way, notice there is a new pane in Blend, which is a data context panel here, which is automatically showing you the view model of the element that is selected. That's a fantastic feature, honestly. I mean, if you have to upgrade to Blend just for that, do it immediately. That's great. Okay? So now the data context of my button is set to the main view model because it's inherited from the user control. User control sets it. The grid doesn't set it, so it's inherited. And the button doesn't set it explicitly, so it's also inherited. So now let's go ahead and take the comment property. Oops. I can do a data binding. Blend knows that my data context is set to my main view model, so I can go ahead and take the refresh command. Say OK, and this command doesn't need a parameter. So now my button is ready to roll. Now, if I was a designer and suddenly I decide, OK, I don't want a button, but I was a context menu instead, well, no problem. You just do the same, but for the context menu. The view model doesn't need to change. So you see the advantage of the command. It's really decoupling. Then the other thing I will do is edit the data template. So I prepared the data template already for the list box. But now I just want to show you that Blend knows that my data context is now set to customer view model and not to main view model anymore. Because when I am inside the list box, inside the data template, the data context is automatically set to the instance, to the item which is displayed. That's a feature of WPF and Silverlight. Okay? So I can go ahead and expand my customers. I have my model property of type customer. So that's the WPF proxy. And now I see all my properties coming from the WCF service. So I can take the first name, going to drag it on this text block, and notice that I have my design data service is working because it's creating my 100 design time customers. Can take the last name. Here we do just a little bit differently. I'm going to drop it here on the UI, but it works the same. Now I can run my app. And we will see that I forgot to do something on purpose. I forgot to remove the cache. Okay? But we see in the background the data is loading. So that's working. So now let's take care of that cache. So here I'm in the main page again. I'm going to show the cache so that we see what we do. And I'm going to create states for my control, for my main page. I'm going to call that the busy states. I will have one state called normal and another state called busy. Now, when I am in normal state, I want my cache to be at 0% opacity. And I also want to collapse it because I want to be able to access what is below. Okay? When it's invisible in terms of opacity, it is still there in the way of your mouse. Okay? If the heat test is set to visible. So in that case, I just remove it. And then in busy state, I'm here. I'm going to add a small transition, just half a second, to make things a little bit smoother. And by the way, I can visualize the transitions in Blend. So that's pretty cool. So now I have my two states. Now I need to tell my control how to switch from one state to the other. So to do that, I'm going to use a Blend behavior, which is included into expression Blend 4 beta, called the data state behavior. I'm going to drag it and drop it on my root. And now I can say when the data binding, which is set to the isBusy property of the main view model, okay? I need to say when the value is set to true, then the true state should go to busy. Oops, busy. And then when it's false, when it's not busy, you should go to normal. Okay, so now I made the binding, but in my view, to my property in the main view model, which is of type Boolean, so you can test the property. Okay? Then the last thing I want to do is show you inside, let me just get out of this recording. Here we go. So now I'm going to go back into my data template. So now I'm inside the data template again. Okay? And I told you that you can execute a command normally out of the box only when a button is clicked, which is annoying. So here in this case, I will use another behavior, which comes from the MVVM Lite toolkit this time, called event to command. I'm going to drop it on the text box. And then I'm going to say you have to react to the lost focus event. So every time that the customer is tabbing out of the text box, this command will be executed. So I choose lost focus. I'm going to data bind. And now I have one small issue. Okay? The data context of the data template, I told you before, is set to the customer view model. But my command is set on the main view model. Okay? But thankfully, we have this global guy, locator, which has a property of type main view model. So I can do my binding through the locator. So I'm going out of the implicit data context of the data template, and I go inside another object inside my main view model, and I'm going to choose the save customer command. This save customer command needs a parameter of type customer view model, so I'm just going to do an empty binding, meaning I just write in XAML binding and nothing else. So I'm binding to the data context of the current element, which is the customer view model. Okay? All right. So now I can run my code. The cache is going to disappear when the data is loaded. If I refresh, okay, the network is faster than at home, so you hardly see it, but it is here. Also, let me show you the XML file, which is actually my data source. And here, see that my name is set to Bunion. I think I can do that a little bit bigger. Here we go. But if I go ahead and edit the name, for example, like this, and then I tab out of the text box, we saw that there was an asynchronous operation. And now if I refresh this file, yep. OK, something didn't work quite well, and I'm not sure what. That's weird. All right, I hope you forgive me for this one, because I won't be able to find out, and I still have things to tell you. So it works, OK? I will publish a sample which does work. All right. So anyway, the command is executed, even though it's not the click event of a button base. All right. So let's go back to the PowerPoint. So now let's talk a little bit, because we are not living in a perfect world. Let's talk a little bit about the flows, the problems of MVVM. So the first thing is that you typically need to write a lot of code when you do MVVM. For example, iNotify property change implementation is quite verbose, because you cannot use automatic properties. You need to expand your properties. Also, commands. I just don't understand why I cannot say event, like for example, mouse left button down event equals binding my method. Okay? And honestly, I think that's something which is going to come in the framework. But right now, you have to go through commands. Also, some operations are tricky, like setting the focus on a UI element from the view model, because typically the view model doesn't know the view. So that's one occasion where it's perfectly fine to write some code behind code if you need to. Why not? Since it relies heavily on the data binding system, which is proper to Silverlight and WPF, you cannot use it in other frameworks which don't have the data binding system. Okay, you can do some MVVM stuff in ASP.NET MVC, for example, but it's a different implementation of the view, so it's not totally compatible. Also, the message to the community is not totally clear, or at least not as clear as it should be, I think. There is no really formal guidance from Microsoft regarding MVVM. There is a lot of confusion with all those toolkits and frameworks. Okay, so don't be confused. MVVM is just a pattern, and the rest is helpers. Check the documentation of the helpers, see where they can help you, but very often you maybe don't even need it. Okay. Now let's talk a little bit about the myths. First myth that we hear a lot: if you do MVVM, you should have zero code in the code behind. Okay, and if you have code in your code behind, the MVVM police is going to take your family away. That's false, okay? That's bollocks. It's wrong. If you have to have code in your code behind, why not? Okay, it's called the code behind for a reason. Just remember that code in the code behind is less easy to test. So that's the problem that you have when you do that. But for certain operations, it's absolutely okay. Also, sometimes you hear if you do MVVM, you don't need converters. Well, you will need less converters for sure, but sometimes it's still useful to have a converter somewhere, okay? Only suitable for big projects. Personally, I disagree. I find myself very often doing a very small application, and then after half an hour, I think, oh, gee, if I had only started with MVVM, and then I refactor. So I think it's really suitable in a lot of cases. Also, the performance question, I went ahead and asked some people at IdentityMind who have a lot of experience in that case, and we don't find that it really affects performance much. The data binding system, which is used heavily, is very optimized. It's true that you have additional code, like, for example, the commanding system if you use relay command, okay? So, you know, your mileage may vary. But for us, we find that the advantage totally overwhelms the inconveniency, okay? MVVM is complex, makes my head hurt. I hope that we saw that it's not that complex. And if your head hurts, it's probably because of last night. I don't need separation because I don't have a designer. Well, separation is good not just for Blend, but also for testability, maintainability. So honestly, it's good everywhere, I think. You cannot use MVVM with other patterns. I really don't see why not. You can totally have a user control with a ViewModel and include that into a non-MVVM application, okay? It will help you for that particular user control in Blend. You can style the piece of your UI. And unfortunately, that is not true either. All right, further information can be found on my blog and website at galasoft.ch. The Get Started page for the toolkit. advancedmvvm.com, that's the website where you find more information on this book. El Bunion is my Twitter handle, so let's continue the discussion. Please fill your evaluation forms. That's helpful for us. And check the two other MVVM talks. One is in this room right after this session by Rob Eisenberg. The other one, Nikhil Kotari, tomorrow. And I don't have much time for questions because I had a lot of things to show you. But I will be available tonight in the Ask the Experts event, which is in the main meal hall from 5 p.m. So find me, okay? I will tweet my locations. I'm also very often in the comments. And if you want to talk, come and meet me. Thank you very much for your attention.